I love watercolor. It's so fresh and it's so spontaneous and it's so exciting. I believe very strongly that we're all born to create, and I think that you can do it if you think you can. It takes desire, it takes determination, and it takes practice. But even more important when it comes to watercolor, it takes learning the basic skills and understanding the fundamental principles. And that's what I want to show you in this video. Now I'm going to show you the 3 most important things that you need to know about watercolor. The dry brush, the wash, and the fine line. But first you need to understand the characteristics of watercolor and what makes the watercolor do what it wants to do. As I'm sure you're aware, watercolor is a very fluid medium. What this means is that the paint flows, it runs, it spreads, and that's very exciting to see what watercolor does. There's no other medium that will do this for you. I tried oil painting one time, and it was a real big shock to me to find out that when you put that first brush stroke on the paper or on the canvas, it just stayed there, and it didn't do anything because I was so used to the explosive excitement of watercolor on paper. What this does is it lends itself to the spontaneity of watercolor. And what you want to do when you're painting in watercolor to add to that is swing your whole arm when you paint. Keep your hand up near the middle of the brush or even up at the end of the brush. Don't get down on the very metal part of the brush, which is the ferrule, or you end up making a very tight, constricted type of line. So remember to keep that brush wet and swing your arm when you're painting in watercolor. The other characteristic of watercolor that's so important is the transparency. Now, if you take a pencil, and remember that you usually draw on your paper before you start to paint, and if you mark with your pencil and then put some color on top of that, because of the transparency of the medium, you can still see the pencil mark. Now, this brings out a very important point, and that is that you must work from light to dark in watercolor and reserve the white of the paper, because otherwise, if you try to work your darks first, you cannot get the lights back into the picture. They're gone once they're gone. Now, to go back to the wash and the dry brush and the line, the wash is your basic stroke, and what the wash does is it applies a large amount of paint to the paper. There are 2 different ways to do a wash. One is this, which is called the flat wash, where you have a fairly even color throughout. Now, the important thing about working in a wash is that you have enough paint in your palette to work from, that you go from the water to the paint and then to the palette. And you don't take that fresh paint right up to the paper. You work it up into the bristles on the palette. Now, as you notice, at the bottom of this wash, there's a little bead of color. It rolls down the paper as you paint. That's because gravity is helping you to paint this picture. Gravity is pulling the water and the pigment out of the brush and depositing it on the paper, and the vertical nature of this is pulling that bead down the paper, and it helps to give you a smoother wash. Now, when you want to do the graded wash, you simply start with your basic wash stroke, and you add water instead of more paint, and you keep adding water to the brush stroke, and it gradually gets lighter as it moves down the paper. Now, the more water you add, the juicier that gets. Oh, juicy is one of the things I love about watercolor. But you've got to do something about this little bead of color when it gets to be that heavy at the bottom. So you do what I call a thirsty brush. You rinse off the paint and squeeze the water out of the brush, and then you apply the corner of it to the bottom edge of the wash, and it slurps up that little bead. Now, if you leave the bead, or if you add more water to the wash than is already there, you get what's called a blossom. You can see little fuzzy edges creeping out from this onto the wet paper. And that can be a wonderful effect, which I like to use sometimes. But if it comes at the end of a wash where you want a nice smooth effect in the wash, then you want to be sure to pick that bead up. So that's your basic brush stroke, and you'll use that a lot to cover the largest amount of the paper. The next stroke is called the dry brush. Now where you held the brush vertical to the paper or perpendicular to the paper for the wash, you're now going to hold it parallel to the paper. And you're going to move it very quickly across so it skips over the paper and deposits paint only on the hills of the paper and not into the valleys. Now your brush still has enough paint in it that you can paint wash strokes, and you can go back and forth between the dry brush and the wash, and that's one of the benefits of using this one-stroke brush. The one-stroke brush holds a lot of water and a lot of paint, and you can work back and forth without having to grab for another brush from your fistful of brushes over here. Finally, another important thing to do with your brush in the watercolor is to make the fine line, and you can make one even with this big brush. You hold your brush perpendicular to the paper and tip your brush upward slightly so that just the corner of the bristles is touching the paper, and you draw downward and you can get a thin line. Now if you use the other corner of your brush, what happens is the bristles press together and give you a wide line, and both of these are very useful. The thin line and the thick line. Now there are a lot of other things that you can do with this watercolor brush, and what I advise you to do when you get your brush is that you play with it and find out just what that brush will do. For example, you can pat with it, and here you're getting a combination of a dry brush effect and the line, or of dry brush and the wash, and then you can use your corner to make little branches, pat some more, and make a tree. You can scribble with it and get a grassy effect. And one of my favorite things to do with it is to pinch it in the middle and make little birds. So there are a lot of different things that you can do with this one brush, and there's no reason why you need lots of different brushes. That's why they call this a one-stroke brush. So those are your basic brush techniques. In this little video, what I've tried to do is give you an idea of what the most basic things are that you need to know to paint in watercolor. These are the books that I've published within the last few years. It's important for you to learn the basics, and what you do in order to accomplish this is you read the books, you take classes, and most important, you practice and you believe in yourselves.